In this episode, we dive into a chilling tale of violence, betrayal, and ruthless revenge. A grandson assaults his step-grandmother, unknowingly passing on HIV to her, which sparks a series of shocking events that ultimately lead to a devastating act of retribution. Join us as we delve into the disturbing details of this case and the actions that followed, leaving everyone in shock. Steven Brickell's life was filled with challenges that would have overwhelmed many. Born into a family struggling with addiction, Steven had to mature faster than most children. Steven's mother, Janice Colton, had been struggling with alcoholism and substance abuse for years. Her battles eventually caught up with her, leading to an arrest for driving under the influence and a prison sentence when Steven was only 10. With no other family to turn to, Steven was sent to live with his step-grandmother, Lorraine Brickell, and her husband, Dean. Living in their modest home in Milton, Georgia, Steven faced many challenges. His step-grandmother, Lori, a retired high school English teacher, did her best to maintain the facade of a stable family life. Meanwhile, Dean, her husband and a former successful businessman, was dealing with the early stages of strokes and dementia, which left Lori to shoulder most of the household responsibilities. Steven's teenage years were marked by turmoil. Despite Lori's best efforts, he had difficulty in school, frequently clashing with teachers and skipping classes. By the time he was 15, he had dropped out altogether. Without the structure of school, Steven fell deeper into a destructive path. He began hanging out with the wrong crowd, experimenting with drugs, and soon spiraled into addiction. By the age of 18, he was homeless, often sleeping in shelters or on the streets, while local charities like the Atlanta Mission offered him food and temporary shelter. Steven had a hard time finding lasting stability. In early 2011, Lori managed to convince Steven to come back home, promising to help him turn his life around. For a time, things looked better. Steven began talking about earning his GED and dreamed of becoming a mechanic, inspired by his late father's love for cars. However, that summer, their relationship took a troubling turn. Lori and Steven's connection grew increasingly inappropriate, eventually becoming sexual. Though Steven rarely spoke about it, those around him noticed a drastic shift in his behavior. Steven became more withdrawn and increasingly prone to angry outbursts. Tensions at home rose, and arguments between him and Lori became frequent. Eventually, Lori confided in a friend, revealing that Steven had started physically abusing her. Neighbors sometimes overheard heated arguments, with Lori shouting and Steven storming out of the house. At 19, Steven had grown into a tall, imposing figure, standing over 6 feet, while Lori, in her late 60s, was no match for him physically. However, Steven's aggression appeared to be driven more by guilt and confusion than by outright malice. In the days before his death, Steven seemed increasingly troubled. Friends noted that he appeared agitated and spoke in vague terms about needing to leave. His growing guilt over his actions, combined with the shame of their relationship, seemed to be weighing on him, something that would tragically lead to his murder. On the crisp fall morning of October 12, 2011, Milton police received a frantic 911 call from Lorraine Brickell. The 68-year-old retiree, Lorraine Brickell, called 911 to report that her step-grandson, Steven Brickell, was unresponsive in his bedroom. She explained that she had gone to check on him after he didn't come down for breakfast, a routine he usually never missed. When officers arrived at the Brickell home, located on a quiet cul-de-sac in the suburban neighborhood, Lori was standing in the driveway, visibly shaken. Neighbors noted that Lori was dressed in a housecoat and slippers, a stark contrast to her usual polished appearance. Officer James Delaney, one of the first responders, later described the scene in his report. While Lori was visibly crying, he found her demeanor strangely calm and composed, given the situation. She kept repeating, "I don't understand how this happened." Steven's body was found in his small bedroom at the back of the house, a space cluttered with clothes, a disassembled engine from a Honda Civic, and posters of classic cars and rock bands like Led Zeppelin. Steven was found lying on his back in his twin bed, which was pushed against the wall. His pants were missing, and his face was covered by a dry cleaning bag. The edges of the bag were twisted tightly around his neck, indicating he had been suffocated. Steven's hands and arms showed signs of bruising, likely from a struggle. A strong smell of bleach lingered in the room, and a half-empty bottle of Clorox was found on the floor near the bed. Detectives quickly noticed the bleach, which seemed out of place, raising suspicions that someone had attempted to clean up the scene. Lori told officers that she had last seen Steven the evening before. He had been in a bad mood and went to bed early, slamming his door behind him. She claimed that she didn't hear anything unusual during the night. A team of forensic investigators arrived within the hour and began documenting the scene. They collected the plastic bag, swabbed the bleach bottle for fingerprints, and took samples from various surfaces in the room for further analysis. As the investigation unfolded, neighbors gathered outside, shocked by the commotion and the police presence in the usually quiet neighborhood. The Brickells were known as a quiet family, so news of Steven's death quickly spread through the community. Steven's body was taken to the Fulton County Medical Examiner's office for an autopsy, leaving behind a shaken household and a growing mystery. When police arrived at the Brickell residence on October 12, 2011, it didn't take long for them to realize that Steven Brickell's death wasn't an accident. Forensic investigators, led by Detective Carlo Monroe, began thoroughly analyzing the scene. Monroe, a seasoned 15-year veteran of the Milton Police Department, was known for her keen instincts and meticulous approach to investigations. The small, cluttered bedroom was quickly sealed off as part of the ongoing investigation. Investigators noted the strong smell of bleach and began collecting samples from the floor, walls, and furniture. The plastic dry cleaning bag that had been twisted around Steven's neck was carefully removed and sent to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GBI, crime lab for testing. As part of the autopsy, forensic experts also conducted a routine blood panel to gather more information about Steven's cause of death. The results of the blood tests revealed a shocking detail. Steven was HIV positive. Medical records showed that he had not sought treatment, implying that he had likely kept his status a secret from those around him. The discovery of Steven's HIV status added a troubling layer to the investigation. At the time, public health campaigns emphasized that HIV was treatable with proper communication and medical care, steps Steven had failed to take. Detectives began to speculate about how long he might have known about his condition and whether it had played a role in his behavior, particularly given the possibility that he had contracted the virus from engaging in risky activities like street prostitution. Back at the scene, forensic technicians identified bruises on Steven's arms, wrists, and chest, indicating he had been involved in a violent struggle before his death. A broken lamp on the nightstand suggested a confrontation, and partial fingerprints were found on the bleach bottle near the bed. Investigators also swabbed the dry cleaning bag for DNA evidence, hoping it would lead them to a suspect. Detective Monroe and her team started reconstructing the events of the previous evening. Lorraine Brickell insisted she had no idea why anyone would want to hurt Steven. However, Monroe picked up on inconsistencies in her story, especially regarding the last time she had seen or spoken to him. By the following day, Media outlets like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution were reporting on the mysterious death of the 19-year-old. The article detailed Steven's battles with addiction and homelessness, offering a somber view of a young man trying to turn his life around. The revelation that Steven was HIV positive added another layer of complexity to the case, raising more questions about the circumstances surrounding his death. Over the years, Steven's ongoing battles with addiction and repeated run-ins with the law took a toll on Lori. At 6 feet tall and over 200 pounds, Steven was much larger than the petite Lori, and their clashes became more frequent and intense. Neighbors often heard their heated arguments, with some even escalating into physical confrontations. During questioning, Lori admitted to Detective Carla Monroe that Steven had become more aggressive in recent months. She revealed that he would often push or grab her during their fights. "He was impossible to control," Lori said. "No matter what I did, he would hit me." At first, Lori portrayed herself as a concerned grandmother who had simply found Steven's lifeless body. But as the hours of interrogation went on, her carefully constructed facade began to break down. Detectives focused on the inconsistencies in her story, particularly regarding the details of what had happened in the hours leading up to Steven's death. When asked about her relationship with Steven, Lori hesitated. Her response seemed overly rehearsed, and her body language grew noticeably tense. As the interrogation continued, detectives uncovered that her resentment towards Steven went far beyond typical family frustrations. Over the years, Lori began to feel more and more controlled by Steven. She described the escalating tension as overwhelming, admitting to feeling helpless in maintaining authority in the household as his demands became never-ending. Detective Monroe later documented the moment in her notes, capturing the weight of Lori's emotions during the interrogation. Lori seemed ashamed as she spoke, but there was an unmistakable bitterness in her tone. She appeared resentful of Steven's control over her and weighed down by the responsibility she had taken on in caring for him. This revelation shifted the focus of the investigation, casting a new light on the dynamics within the household. Detectives began to wonder if Lori's deep resentment and the power imbalance between her and Steven had finally escalated to violence. Her carefully maintained facade now appeared to be a mask, concealing years of frustration and guilt. The investigation then shifted to Dean Brickell, Steven's 79-year-old biological grandfather, who became the next person of interest. Once a successful businessman, Dean had become physically frail and mentally impaired after suffering several strokes, which left him with significant memory loss and periods of confusion. He spent most of his days at home, confined to a recliner in the living room, either watching reruns of old westerns or the evening news on CNN. To the outside world, Dean appeared as a distant, harmless figure within the Brickell household. Neighbors described Dean as quiet and pleasant, though many observed that Lori seemed to carry the bulk of the responsibilities at home. His health problems had turned him into a passive observer, leaving Lori to deal with Steven's unpredictable behavior on her own. During questioning, detectives tried to determine what Dean might have witnessed regarding the household dynamics in the days leading up to Steven's death. To their surprise, detectives found that Dean was completely unaware of the illicit relationship between Steven and Lori. Detective Carla Monroe, who led the interrogation, described Dean as cooperative but visibly confused. "He genuinely seemed shocked when we brought up the affair," she noted in her case file. He responded, "That's absurd. Lori would never." He looked genuinely hurt, as though he was grappling with a betrayal he hadn't anticipated. Dean's health challenges, along with his dependence on others for basic care, made him largely unaware of what was happening within his own home. Detectives noted that his room was on the opposite side of the house from Steven's, and his declining mobility likely made it difficult for him to overhear or observe any interactions that might have raised concern. His obliviousness painted a sad picture of a man who had lost control over his household. Although detectives considered Dean a suspect early on, they ultimately found no evidence linking him to Steven's death. His frail condition and genuine shock during questioning made it clear that he was not involved in the crime. However, his complete ignorance of the affair shed light on the deep secrecy and dysfunction that had taken hold of the Brickell household. As the investigation progressed, detectives uncovered a shocking twist that changed their understanding of the events leading to Steven Brickell's death. Forensic tests, including toxicology and blood work, revealed that Steven had been living with HIV. This discovery prompted investigators to return to the Brickell household, where they began to delve deeper into the tense and complex relationship between Steven and his step-grandmother, Lori. Detectives revisited Lori's medical history and conducted interviews with those close to her. During these inquiries, a troubling revelation came to light. Lori had recently confided in a friend that she feared she had contracted HIV from Steven. Lori had learned of Steven's HIV diagnosis shortly before his death, a discovery that left her both devastated and angry. The affair, already a hidden and troubling secret, had escalated into something much darker and more dangerous. To make matters worse, investigators found evidence indicating that Steven had been physically abusive toward Lori in the weeks leading up to his death. Interviews with neighbors revealed that Lori often wore long-sleeved clothing and heavy makeup, even during the unusually warm October weather. When questioned about this, Lori claimed it was simply a personal preference. However, one neighbor recalled seeing bruises on her arms during a casual visit. Additionally, detectives discovered text messages on Lori's phone from Steven, suggesting a volatile and controlling relationship between them. In one particularly chilling exchange, Steven threatened to expose their affair to the family unless Lori gave him money. This digital evidence not only supported Lori's claims of emotional and physical abuse, but also added complexity to her potential motives. The discovery shifted the focus of the investigation, painting a picture of a woman pushed to her breaking point, caught in a desperate and dangerous situation. Forensic psychologist Dr. Wendy Kwok, brought in to consult on the case, noted in her report that Lori's situation was a perfect storm of fear, anger, and desperation. The combination of physical abuse, the secret of the affair, and the discovery of Steven's HIV diagnosis created an environment ripe for tragedy, Kwok wrote. For detectives, this new information didn't clear Lori of involvement, but rather intensified their suspicions, adding a darker layer to the unfolding investigation. The affair and the subsequent violence pointed to a toxic relationship that may have ultimately escalated to murder. While Lori had initially portrayed herself as a victim of circumstance, the mounting evidence suggested a more calculated response to a deeply personal betrayal. This revelation marked a turning point in the investigation, compelling detectives to shift their focus more squarely onto Lori as a potential suspect in Steven's death. It also underscored the complex and harrowing dynamics within the Brickell household. Another figure under scrutiny was Janice Colton, Steven Brickell's mother. Her release from prison just days before Steven's death raised questions for investigators. The affair and the subsequent violence pointed to a toxic relationship that may have ultimately escalated to murder. While Lori had initially portrayed herself as a victim of circumstance, the mounting evidence suggested a more calculated response to a deeply personal betrayal. This revelation marked a turning point in the investigation, compelling detectives to shift their focus more squarely onto Lori as a potential suspect in Steven's death. Despite multiple stints in rehab, Janice frequently relapsed, which led to several run-ins with law enforcement. Her most recent prison sentence stemmed from a DUI that resulted in a minor car accident. She had been released on parole just 5 days before Steven was found dead. Janice's return to Milton, Georgia, was quiet, but police later discovered she had already been in contact with several family members, including Dean Brickell, Steven's grandfather. As detectives pieced together Janice's movements in the days before the murder, they uncovered a startling revelation. Janice had been secretly having an affair with Dean. At 79 years old, Dean's declining health and dementia made the affair with Janice both unconventional and shocking to the family. Evidence of their relationship surfaced through intercepted text messages on Janice's phone and interviews with family friends, who recalled strange behavior between the two at past gatherings, including inappropriate touching. What made this revelation even more significant, however, was Steven's involvement in the situation. Just days before his death, Steven had discovered the affair. Investigators learned of a heated argument between Steven and Janice, witnessed by a neighbor. The neighbor reported that Steven confronted his mother, accusing her of betraying the family and exploiting Dean's vulnerable condition. Witnesses described Steven storming out of the house that evening, visibly upset after the argument. Police later questioned Janice about the affair and its potential connection to Steven's death. Initially, she denied the relationship, insisting that her visits to the Brickell home were only to discuss family matters with Dean. However, when confronted with the text messages and corroborating witness accounts, Janice broke down and confessed to the affair. She maintained, however, that she had no involvement in her son's death, tearfully insisting she would never harm him, despite their troubled relationship. While Janice's affair with Dean complicated the family dynamics, investigators could not find direct evidence linking her to the murder. Still, Janice's presence in the household and her tumultuous history with Steven made her a key person of interest as the investigation progressed. One of the most shocking revelations of the case, however, was the involvement of Lori Brickell, Steven's step-grandmother. Investigators uncovered that on the night of Steven's death, Lori had killed him using a method that was both unexpected and chilling. Late on the night of October 12, 2011, Lori made a decision. She had been living in a suffocating and abusive relationship with Steven for years. The physical and emotional toll had been too much to bear, especially after learning about his HIV diagnosis. She was exhausted by his controlling behavior, hurtful words, and endless demands. Instead, she was overwhelmed with a mix of fear, guilt, and disbelief. She had just taken a life, and the gravity of her actions began to settle in. But in that moment, she knew she had to hide what she had done. Lori went to the kitchen, grabbed a bottle of bleach, and began cleaning the room, focusing on the area around the bed where Steven had been killed. She wiped down every surface, desperate to eliminate any trace of what had happened. In that moment, she felt emotionally detached, consumed by the need to cover her tracks and ensure that her crime would remain hidden. Lori went about her routine as if nothing had changed. She masked her inner turmoil and pretended to be the same caregiver she had always been, but deep down, she couldn't shake the knowledge of what she had done. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Lori had been meticulous in trying to erase any evidence of the crime. However, she overlooked one critical mistake, leaving behind traces of her own DNA. During subsequent interrogations, Lori's behavior raised suspicions. Her responses were inconsistent, and investigators observed her growing nervousness, signaling that something was amiss. The strong scent of bleach in the room, along with the absence of any signs of a struggle and the clear evidence of suffocation, raised immediate red flags. Forensic testing soon confirmed investigators' suspicions. Lori's fingerprints were found on the dry cleaning bag, and traces of her hair were discovered in the room. Her emotional detachment during questioning, paired with the physical evidence, ultimately led detectives to the conclusion that Lori was responsible for Steven's death. When Lori was arrested, her reaction was one of startling indifference. Rather than remorse, she seemed to experience a sense of relief, as though a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. The shock of being caught was evident, but beneath it all, Lori felt that, for the first time in years, she had regained control over her life. In March 2012, Lori Brickell stood trial for the brutal murder of her stepson, Steven Brickell. After an extensive investigation, law enforcement had gathered enough evidence to charge her with first-degree murder. The case quickly captured local attention, drawing public interest due to the disturbing combination of family secrets, long-standing abuse, and the chilling nature of the crime itself, which seemed almost unimaginable. Lori's defense attorney, Richard Casalobo, argued that she had acted out of self-defense, suggesting that Steven's history of violent behavior and their complicated abusive relationship had left Lori fearing for her safety. Casalobo painted her as a victim who had been driven to her breaking point. However, the prosecution, led by District Attorney Linda Barakowski, rejected this argument, asserting that the evidence pointed to a premeditated act rather than a desperate response to immediate danger. The prosecution argued that Lori's actions were deliberate and premeditated, emphasizing that she had carefully planned Steven's death. They pointed to the forensic evidence, including Lori's fingerprints on the dry cleaning bag used to suffocate Steven and traces of her hair found at the scene. The use of bleach to clean the room was also highlighted, suggesting that Lori had made extensive efforts to erase any evidence of the crime. These details painted a picture of a calculated cover-up rather than a spontaneous act of self-defense. During the trial, Lori's defense attorney called her to the stand to testify about the years of abuse she had endured at the hands of her stepson. Lori described how Steven had become increasingly violent and manipulative, recounting instances where he physically threatened her and demanded money. She painted a picture of a woman pushed to the edge, driven by fear and desperation. She claimed that on the night of the murder she had acted in self-defense, fearing for her life after yet another confrontation with Steven. The defense tried to portray her as a woman who had reached her breaking point, using her testimony to invoke sympathy. However, the prosecution countered by arguing that Lori's actions were calculated, with no immediate threat to her life at the time of the murder. They pointed to her deliberate attempt to cover up the crime and the absence of any signs of a struggle, suggesting that Steven had been caught off guard while he slept. She confessed to the crime, stating that she felt cornered and saw no other option. However, her detached demeanor and the deliberate way in which she carried out the murder made her explanation hard to believe. After several days of deliberation, the jury came to a decision. Lori Brickell was convicted of first-degree murder. The verdict sparked mixed emotions among the public. Some sympathized with her, viewing her as a victim of years of abuse, while others were shocked and outraged by the brutal way in which she ended Steven's life. At her sentencing hearing, Judge Thomas Mitchell sentenced Lori to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He stated that while it was clear Lori had suffered in her relationship with Steven, the murder was a premeditated act of violence. There are no excuses for taking another person's life, Judge Mitchell said. Lori's defense lawyer Richard Casalovo voiced his disappointment with the verdict, though he acknowledged and respected the court's decision. Meanwhile, District Attorney Linda Barakowski commended the jury for their thorough deliberation and thoughtful evaluation of the evidence. Lori Brickell was taken into custody to begin her prison sentence, her fate now determined as she faced the consequences of her actions. After Lori Brickell was found guilty in March 2012, Her life changed drastically. She was given a life sentence in prison with no chance of parole and was sent to a correctional facility to serve her time. The trial received a lot of media attention, particularly in the small town where she had lived, leaving many people stunned by the crime and the complicated relationships surrounding it. While in prison, Lori spent her time reflecting on her choices and the impact they had on others. Meanwhile, Dean and Janice's lives took an unexpected turn. Despite their difficult history and the strange love triangle that unfolded before Steven's death, the two ended up getting married in 2012. After Steven's death, Dean and Janice's relationship became more widely known, with many in the community talking about their unconventional connection. Some believed that Dean's marriage to Janice was a way for him to seek redemption, as they both tried to move forward from the turmoil caused by their son's death. Unfortunately, their marriage didn't last long. Only months after their marriage, Dean had a severe stroke and died in early 2013. His unexpected passing surprised many, as he had seemed healthy. Janice was heartbroken, but her strength quickly showed as she turned to her faith for comfort. After Dean's death, Janice began going to church more often. She started volunteering with local youth programs and eventually became a youth pastor. Her transformation was truly remarkable. Once known for her battles with drugs and alcohol, Janice transformed into a dedicated leader, helping troubled teens turn their lives around. She embraced her past struggles, using them to connect with the young people she worked with, aiming to steer them away from the mistakes she had made. While her history was still quietly discussed in her community, Janice found a new sense of purpose in her role as a youth pastor. In the years that followed, Janice earned a reputation for transforming her life and helping others do the same. Her story became a symbol of redemption, proving that even after the most difficult times, it's possible to rebuild and find a new path.